Pilgrim vs. the World was released in 2010, and believe it or not, it is one of my favorite comic book films, as well as one of my favorite films of all time. Although I wouldn't place it as a strong favorite, but I love this film! So let's get right to the review. I have to be honest on one thing, this is actually the only film that I have seen that is directed by Edgar Wright at the time that I'm recording this review, but I will eventually get around to reviewing Shaun of the Dead as well as Hot Fuzz, because I heard those two are actually pretty fantastic when it comes to Edgar Wright's films. Also, I heard the two are hilarious. In the first 10 to 15 minutes, you can tell right away that this film is going to be very stylish, and it continues to do so until the end of the film. And actually, I think that was the intention for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, because the comics were also very stylish with its video game homages and references, as well as some anime references here and there. So there is a point to why the comics operated a certain way and why the film operated a certain way. You also may have noticed the comic book sound effects that were inserted in several to many scenes throughout the film. And this may sound silly, but it actually works in this film's case. I also noticed that this film also emulates the technique of speedlining that is very common in anime. Now, I don't see that as a problem with the film because the comics did the exact same thing, except the comics was more paying homage to the art form of manga. So with this film, they decided to take the route and decide to emulate an anime technique that is very commonly used. So this is actually a nice little touch with Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I have already said recently that this film is very stylish. That is actually because of the cinematography, which is, well, all over the place, in a fun way. In this film's case, the cinematography is top-notch. The editing is also well done, and some of the visual effects pays homage to a couple of art mediums. The acting also works in this film as well. Now, some people may not like Michael Cera as Scott Pilgrim, but if you actually consider Scott Pilgrim's character in the comics, Michael Cera is actually well casted as Scott Pilgrim because his awkward moments actually work in the film. Kieran Culkin is hilarious as Scott's gay roommate Wallace. And did you know Kieran Culkin is the brother of Macaulay Culkin? The music was composed by Nigel Godrich, which I think was a very important factor when it came to adapting the comics into a feature film. The story and the characters are faithful for the most part, but there were moments in the comics where Scott Pilgrim is playing alongside his bandmates of Sex Bob-omb. So how did Edgar Wright and his crew pull adapting those scenes off? By hiring a well-known music producer. Nigel Godrich is best known as the producer of a very well-known British musical act that is currently active today, since 1993. A band you probably may have heard of. Nigel Godrich is Radiohead's producer since 1997, starting with OK Computer. And for the record, I got into Scott Pilgrim before I got into Radiohead, so if anyone's thinking that I am heavily fanboying about the soundtrack of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, I am not. But I cannot deny that the soundtrack does kick ass. It was until I got into Radiohead that I found out that their producer did the soundtrack for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The soundtrack in this film is praiseworthy. Not only is it fun and electrifying, it is also very fitting for this kind of film. Now, not only does Nigel Godrich make the music for this film, he also acts as a producer as well, like he has been doing for years, especially during the scenes where Scott Pilgrim is playing alongside his bandmates. Now, I know that term of, Nigel Godrich also acts as a producer for the film, but I can tell that that was the approach that the soundtrack was going for. And not many films are handled this often, so it's kind of a rare treat for someone like Nigel Godrich being a producer handling the soundtrack for a film. If you like the characters in the Scott Pilgrim comics, well, that's a good thing for this film because this film is mostly faithful to the source material. Now, there are some liberties taken with some of the characters, but not by a whole lot. So that's a good thing. When it comes to the plot, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World plays it by the book, at least about 90% of the time, except for the sixth and final volume. How the sixth and final volume is adapted into film does play out differently than what the sixth and final volume had in store, although the ending is nearly identical to what the comics had. But I'm actually okay with this because this is a film adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim comics, so liberties have to be taken. And also, adapting 6 volumes into a nearly 2-hour film, yeah, you have to cut out some stuff and maybe change some things around. And actually, the film adaptation works on its own. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is an awesome film. If you love anime and or video games, I strongly recommend Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And for about 5 years now, I have been in lesbians with this series. And Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is one of my favorite films of all time. Not a strong favorite, and it is nowhere in my top 10 list. But it's somewhere in my favorites. It's just I haven't compiled a list of my favorite films of all time because I've yet to see hundreds and thousands of films for me to make such a list. So that's a work in progress. But out of all the modern films I have seen, this one is definitely a film I love revisiting because, like the comics, I am in lesbians with this film. I am going to give Scott Pilgrim vs. the World a 10. Before I close this review, I want to talk a little bit about Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game. It is obviously a video game tie-in to the film. I am willing to review this game. There's just one problem. It is no longer available through Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. In other words, I have no means to play the game unless a friend of mine still owns the game somehow. I will see you in the next review.